Pusat Pengkajian Islam dan Masyarakat PPIM UIN Jakarta merupakan lembaga penelitian otonom di lingkungan UIN Syarif Hidayatullah Jakarta. Lembaga ini didirikan pada 1 April 1995 untuk mengajak sejumlah sarjana dari berbagai macam disiplin ilmu dan latar belakang untuk mengadakan kegiatan penelitian, pengkajian, pelatihan, dan penyebaran informasi khususnya tentang Islam Indonesia dan Islam Asia Tenggara pada umumnya. Berlokasi di Gedung Kampus 2 UIN Jakarta, Kota Tangerang Selatan, pada tahun 2021 PPIM memiliki 6 program. Di antaranya, Studia Islamika, Thesaurus Manuskrip, Knowledge Sector Initiative, Convey Indonesia, Dreamsea, dan Merit Indonesia. Misi PPIM sendiri yaitu melakukan kajian-kajian strategis tentang kehidupan dan pendidikan keagamaan untuk mempengaruhi kebijakan dan perubahan masyarakat. Mengembangkan PPIM UIN Jakarta sebagai lembaga riset berbasis kampus yang unggul, mandiri, dan terpercaya. Membangun jaringan kerja dengan berbagai pihak untuk mengadvokasi hasil-hasil kajian. Memperkuat kapasitas riset diantaranya peneliti, metodologi, produk-produk pengetahuan, manajemen riset, dan pengelolaan pengetahuan. Serta mengembangkan dan menyebarluaskan kekayaan tradisi Islam di Indonesia di berbagai tingkatan untuk kehidupan dan kemanusiaan.
PPIM itu didirikan untuk menjembatani perbedaan atau kekurangan informasi yang berkaitan dengan kajian-kajian Islam di Indonesia secara khusus dan kajian-kajian Islam di Asia Tenggara. Selama ini sangat sedikit sekali kajian-kajian berkaitan dengan Islam di daerah periferal, kita sebut daerah pinggiran. Nah, PPIM memberikan banyak informasi-informasi tentang apa sesungguhnya kajian-kajian Islam yang berkembang di tanah air di Indonesia. Selama ini PPIM melakukan beberapa penelitian berkaitan dengan isu-isu sosial yang itu kaitannya dengan masyarakat Muslim di Indonesia. Jadi kita melakukan penelitian dan riset-riset strategis yang berkaitan dengan misalnya Islam dan demokrasi, Islam dan isu-isu gender, Islam dan lingkungan, dan juga isu-isu konsolidasi yang berkaitan dengan demokrasi di Indonesia. Beberapa tahun terakhir ini PPIM bekerjasama dengan beberapa lembaga internasional juga terlibat aktif dalam diseminasi toleransi di kalangan para pemuda di Indonesia.
Didukung oleh Dewan Penasehat, diantaranya Dewan Manajemen yang terdiri dari dan tenaga peneliti ahli, diantaranya sesuai dengan misinya untuk membangun jaringan kerja dengan berbagai pihak di dalam maupun di luar. PPIM mempertahankan jaringannya dengan lembaga-lembaga negara seperti Kementerian Urusan Agama, Departemen Pendidikan dan Kebudayaan, Agensi Kontraterorisme, lalu berkembang bekerjasama dengan organisasi muslim seperti Nahdlatul Ulama dan Muhammadiyah. Pada level internasional, PPIM sudah menjalin kerjasama dengan UNDP, The Asian Foundation, Ford Foundation, Kedutaan Denmark, Australian DFAT, Kedutaan US, Kedutaan Belanda, Kedutaan Jepang, Japan Foundation, Sekretariat ASEAN. Belakangan ini juga PPIM menjadi tuan rumah bagi para cendekiawan internasional yang datang dari seluruh dunia seperti Australian National University, Melbourne University, Leiden University, Utrecht University, Indiana University, Boston University, McGill University, hingga British Columbia University. Program-program yang ada di PPIM hadir menjawab kebutuhan terhadap akademisi ilmu dan mempromosikan kajian keislaman pada dunia. Studia Islamika merupakan program utama yang ada di PPIM. Program ini pertama kali terbit pada tahun 1994, di mana ia memiliki konsen dalam menyebarkan penelitian dan temuan-temuan mutakhir tentang kajian keislaman. Di samping itu, Studia Islamika sudah menjadi internationally recognized jurnal di Indonesia. Bukan hanya diakui sebagai jurnal internasional, Studia Islamika sudah terindeks di 38 sistem indeks dan merupakan satu dari 6 jurnal di Indonesia yang masuk dalam indeks Scopus sejak 30 Mei 2015. Tidak hanya berkonsentrasi dalam isu-isu kemanusiaan dan pendidikan tentang Islam di Indonesia maupun Asia Tenggara, PPIM juga memberikan perhatian khusus terhadap isu terorisme, gender, hingga pandemi yang sudah melanda sejak tahun 2020. Hal ini dikarenakan PPIM sendiri selalu berkembang mengikuti isu-isu yang sedang hangat terjadi, namun tidak lepas kaitannya dengan pendidikan agama. Kesungguhan PPIM dalam melakukan penelitian terbukti pada tahun 2016. Peneliti PPIM berhasil mendunia dengan 3 karya bukunya berhasil mendapat perhatian dunia internasional. Pertama, hasil penelitian gerakan dan jaringan tarekat Syatariah di Asia Tenggara yang diterbitkan oleh ILCAA, Tokyo University, Jepang. Kedua, naskah buku tentang agama dan regulasi di Indonesia yang diterbitkan oleh Palgrave Macmillan. Dan yang ketiga, penelitian disertasi tentang pesantren-pesantren Salafi di Indonesia yang menarik perhatian Margaret Scott, seorang jurnalis Amerika Serikat.
PPIM adalah sebuah lembaga independen yang didirikan di UIN Syarif Hidayatullah Jakarta untuk melakukan penelitian dan juga mempublikasikan dalam bentuk jurnal maupun buku-buku keislaman yang dalam bahasa Inggris maupun dalam bahasa Arab, sehingga nanti bisa dijadikan rujukan bagi orang-orang asing jika mereka ingin mempelajari tentang Islam di Indonesia. Selama ini kita tahu bahwa Islam Indonesia adalah penduduk mayoritas di dunia. Jumlah Islam di Indonesia itu jika dibandingkan dengan semua Islam di Timur Tengah, kita masih lebih banyak. Tapi sayangnya bahwa belum banyak orang yang tahu tentang Islam di Indonesia. Kajian-kajian keislaman di dunia barat seperti di Eropa, di Amerika, di Australia masih sedikit sekali yang merujuk tentang Islam di Indonesia. Mereka masih merujuk tentang Islam yang ada di Timur Tengah maupun di Asia Selatan seperti Pakistan. Saya kira saatnya Indonesia menunjukkan diri bahwa mereka adalah mempunyai kajian-kajian keislaman yang baik. Sehingga saya kira PPIM mempunyai suatu posisi yang penting bagaimana terus melakukan kajian-kajian keislaman melalui penelitian-penelitian yang berkualitas tentang Islam di Indonesia dan dipublikasikan dalam jurnal internasional yang berbahasa Inggris maupun bahasa Arab agar bisa menjadi rujukan tentang Islam Indonesia.
Kegiatan yang sedang dan pernah dijalankan oleh PPIM. Thesaurus Manuskrip, yang menjadi database yang menghimpun data-data hasil penelitian terhadap manuskrip keislaman di Indonesia. Knowledge Sector Initiative, 2013 hingga sekarang, merupakan kemitraan dengan Australia. Program ini bertujuan untuk mendukung dan mengadvokasi lembaga penelitian untuk menyebarluaskan temuan penelitiannya kepada pemerintah. Convey Indonesia, sebagai proyek yang dirancang untuk mengidentifikasi dan mengatasi faktor-faktor mendasar yang mendorong pertumbuhan ekstremisme kekerasan dalam pendidikan agama. Proyek yang dilakukan sejak tahun 2016 hingga sekarang ini mendapat pengawasan ketat dari UNDP. PPIM dan Pusat Penelitian Kebudayaan Manuskrip CSMC, University of Hamburg, berkolaborasi dengan mengimplementasikan Digital Repository of Endangered and Affected Manuscripts in Southeast Asia atau DRIMSI, sebuah program yang berupaya melestarikan manuskrip yang ada di seluruh wilayah Asia Tenggara. Program ini berlangsung selama 5 tahun, sejak 2017 hingga 2022. Lalu ada Merit Indonesia, yang berfokus pada isu-isu terkait keberagaman baik di media lama maupun media baru. Pada program inilah, PPIM menjalin kerjasama dengan Kedutaan Besar Kerajaan Belanda di Jakarta. Saat ini, PPIM UIN Jakarta sudah menghasilkan beberapa karya buku dan hasil penelitian, di antaranya Gen Z, Kegaulan Identitas Agama, Politik Global dan Hak-Hak Perempuan, Potret Guru Agama, Intoleransi Pendidikan Agama Islam, Agama Publik dan Private, Suara Salafisme, Memahami Terorisme, Masyarakat Cina, Menteri-Menteri Agama RI, Radikalisme Agama, dan beberapa lainnya.
Ya, harapan kami semoga ke depan PPIM semakin menjadi jendela informasi dan pengetahuan bagi studi-studi yang berkaitan dengan Islam di Indonesia secara khusus dan Islam di Asia Tenggara secara umum. Karena itu kita berharap sekali bahwa nantinya PPIM dengan kerja-kerja keras yang kita lakukan, dengan penelitian-penelitian yang kita lakukan menjadi sebuah lembaga yang kredibel secara akademik dengan reputasi yang sangat baik. Saya pikir itu. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yeah, hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's 2:30 p.m. in Jakarta, and all the resource person is already here with us. It means that the PPIM seminar is ready to begin. Actually, we are still waiting for one speaker from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, but maybe he can join later. So I think we can begin the seminar. But before that, let us take a moment to review a few technical details. First, to participants who join the seminar from Zoom, please kindly rename your ID to include your name and institutions. Second, to reduce noise and prevent any sounds problem, please mute your audio unless the committee asks you to turn it on, but don't forget to turn on your video. Third, you may want to drop your questions regarding the topic via Zoom chat or YouTube live sections for Q&A session later. Or for participants in Zoom, you may also click raise hand to ask the questions directly on the Q&A sessions later. Last but not least, we would like to remind all participants that you have to fill the attendance form in the link that will be sent through the chat box so you can get e-certificate for today's seminar. Please make sure to write your name and email correctly. This event is recorded and broadcasted through PPIM YouTube channel. So, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good afternoon from Jakarta. It's indeed a great honor for us to welcome you to the 41st PPIM seminar, bringing book discussions, Cambodia's Muslim and the Malay world, Malay language, Jawi script, and Islamic factionalism from the 19th century to present. The 41st PPIM seminar is organized by Studia Islamika Jurnal in cooperation with the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, State Islamic University, Jakarta. I am Dita, and I'll be the moderator for this seminar. First of all, I would like to express our gratitude and welcome to our resource persons, as well as to check that the audio works properly. Good afternoon, Dr. Philipp Bruckmayr.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, yes.
Nice to meet you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, and also I would like to greet our discussion for today, Professor Dr. Jajat Burhanudin. Good afternoon, Pak Jajat.
Ya, good afternoon. Hi, Philipp. Rita.
Hi.
Hey, Pak Ismet, teman-teman.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
And also would like to welcome the Deputy Dean of Faculty of Art and Humanities, State Islamic University, Jakarta, Mr. Usep Abdul Matin, PhD. Good afternoon, Pak Usep.
Good afternoon, Mbak Dita, Pak Ismet, Pak Jajat, and Pak Philipp, Pak Nida.
Yeah, and of course, I would also to welcome the one and only our Executive Director, Professor Ismat Turopi. Good afternoon, Pak Ismet.
Halo, gimana kabar? How are you?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for us on today's seminar. PPIM seminar is held to disseminate recent research of Islamic studies in Southeast Asia as the main focus of Studia Islamika, an international journal published by the Center for the Study of Islam and Society, PPIM, State Islamic University, Jakarta. So to explore more about Studia Islamika, we would like to invite our Executive Director, Professor Ismat Turopi, to also deliver the opening remarks. Pak Ismet, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Rita. Good evening, everybody. Selamat sore, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. On behalf of PPIM, I would like to extend our gratitude and appreciation to you all, especially for Philipp Bruckmayr. Sorry if I misspell your name. And also Professor Jajat Burhanudin, our fellow, who are where are you now, Pak Jajat? Somewhere around the corner of Leiden, right?
Yes, I'm in Leiden now.
Okay. Thank you very much for being a resource person. Also, Dr. Usep Abdul Matin. Thank you very much. So, what can I say for this one? I would like to reiterate what is really a PPIM seminar. So this seminar has been conducted in collaboration with Faculty of Adab and Humanities and also PPIM and Studia Islamika. So as we have seen from our videos that PPIM or Pusat Pengkajian Islam dan Masyarakat, or the Center of Studying Islam and Society, is an autonomous institution under Islamic State University in Jakarta. And our main concern of research are indeed on researching religious life and religious education. So PPIM is the organization that published Studia Islamika. Studia Islamika is a Scopus Indexed journal, international journal, and the main concern of research in Studia Islamika is, of course, Islam in Southeast Asia. So this seminar is part of our two monthly regular activities of PPIM, particularly to discuss the new development or new findings or new books regarding to Islam in Indonesia or Islam in Southeast Asia. And for today, we are lucky that we have Dr. Philipp Bruckmayr, who has been published very good books on Cambodian Islam and the Malay world. So as we are aware that unlike any other region in Southeast Asia, Muslim constitute as a minority in Cambodia, unlike Indonesia or Malaysia or Brunei, that Muslim becoming a majority. So in this book, if I'm not mistaken, we'll be discussing the development of a Cambodian Muslim as minority from the beginning of 19th centuries, how they survive when the regime of Khmer dominating the region, and how they deal with the rise of development of, let's say, Salafism or the new model of Islamism in Southeast Asia. So this is, I think, we will learn a lot from this book. And I don't want to take too much time. So without any further ado, again, I would like to thanks to you all for participating in these seminars. And we hope that we learn a lot from the discussion, and we learn a lot from the book that has been published recently in Real by Dr. Philipp Bruckmayr. So again, thank you very much, and hoping that we learn a lot today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Ismet. And to give more information about today's discussion, we would like to invite Pak Usep Abdul Matin to give a speech. Pak Usep, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Mbak Dita. And Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Salam.
Salam sejahtera for all of us. Good afternoon to you all in Indonesia. And I think good night to Pak Dr. Philipp Bruckmayr, in the United States of America. It might be night already, Pak? Okay. So also, thank you very much, Pak Prof. Ismaturafi, Pak Prof. Jajat Burhanudin, and especially to Pak Nida, Muhammad Nida Padlan, who has invited me to substitute my dean Dr. Saiful Umam MA in welcoming this prestigious occasion. I am highly pleased to welcome this seminar because it is a part of collaboration between the Faculty of Adab and Humanities of Sharif Hidayatullah State Islamic University in Jakarta and PPIM, Pusat Pengkajian Islam dan Masyarakat, the Center for the Study on Islam and Society, which is well known globally, nationally, and regionally. And thank you very much to PPIM, especially Pak Ismatul Rafi, for leading our faculty to this step to join the global academic values, one of which is this international seminar. So this is, as far as I know, an academic tradition which has been established by PPIM since 2012 in its collaboration with the Faculty of Adab and Humanities of UIN Jakarta. And in this discussion, I think our panelists, Pak Philipp and Pak Prof Jajat, are going to dissect, membedah, are going to dissect new study on the development of Islam in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Normally, we invite PhD scholars research or studies, and also we dissect new books that we consider to be phenomenal. And we regard Dr. Philipp Bruckmayr's research is one of the phenomenal one, one of the most interesting to us. So thank you very much, Dr. Philipp, for being here with us. In addition, so the contents of our study today would be Muslim in Cambodia and the Malay world. And this study, I think, is highly important to reposition Nusantara in the global study. And Nusantara, which has been well known today as Malay, as a country speaking Malay, which is limited to South Filipina, and South Thailand. By this study, we are learned to understand that we have also some network to Cambodia, which is very well known as Champa. When I was undergraduate studies, when I was undergraduate student, at IAIN Jakarta, I used to study about the coming of Islam from Champa. So this is about Cambodia. So this is significant, very magnificent, to see the network between Islam in Cambodia and Islam in Indonesia, Nusantara. And in my conviction, Faculty of Adab and Humanities of UIN Syarif Hidayatullah Jakarta has a great interest in this study. Why? Because Faculty of Adab and Humanities has its own study program of SKI, Sejarah Kebudayaan Islam, Islamic History and Culture, or Islamic History and Civilization, especially Islam in Southeast Asia. So welcome, Pak Dr. Philipp Bruckmayr, and please feel at home. I think Pak Jajat will escort you as well as Ibu Dita. And thank you very much again, Pak Prof. Ismaturofi, for this giant corpus of intellectualism. Yeah. And this is, I think, a type of universalism, because Faculty of Adab and Humanities bow to the academic rule, which is operated globally. Yeah. So thank you very much. And I apologize for not joining till the end because I have a class at 3 p.m. Yeah. So thank you very much, Mbak Dita. Wa ma taufiq illa billah, alaihi tawakkaltu wa ilaihi unib. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Pak Usep, and good luck for your class after this. And ladies and gentlemen,
Mohon izin Mbak Dita ya, mohon izin Pak Ismet dan Pak Philipp, sorry.
Ya, silakan Pak, terima kasih. Ladies and gentlemen, beside the research results and articles, the Studia Islamika Journal also have a book review section. This section aims to disseminate the recent published book about Islam in Southeast Asia. Therefore, here today we are delighted to discuss the book written by Dr. Philipp Bruckmayr, published in 2019. Before that, I would like to introduce Dr. Philipp. He teaches Arabic and Islamic studies at the University of Vienna. His research concentrates on transnational Islam and Muslim minorities in Southeast Asia and the Americas. In 2007, he received the third prize of the Young Scholar Awards of the ISIM Review Leiden. In 2008, he took part in the Muslim Civilization Abstract Program of the Aga Khan University London, and since 2009, involved in the data project Thesaurus of Indonesian Manuscript. Ladies and gentlemen, this book, Cambodia's Muslim and the Malay World, explores the integrations of Cambodia's Muslim minority in the Southeast Asian Muslim Scholar Network through what the author calls as Jawisation. Muslim in Cambodia is, of course, cannot be separated from the socio-religious dynamics that take place in other Malay world. But the fact is, the Muslim community in this region has received less attention from academia, especially when compared to Muslims in Indonesia and Malaysia. So therein lies the strength of this book. Without waiting any longer, let's hear directly from the author of this book. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Philipp Bruckmayr. Mr. Philipp, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy about this invitation because I've been an avid reader of Studia Islamika for many years. So it's an honor to me to be in this forum. And I want to thank Pak Ismatu and Pak Usep and Ibu Dita for the kind introduction you gave. I will, without further ado, move right into my presentation. So I will try to share my screen first. All right. Can you see it already?
Yeah, we can see it.
Good. Good. My book basically has two main arguments. The first one, which is already encapsulated to a certain extent in the title, is that I presume that in Southeast Asia, there has been a process of what I call Javization. So it applies it attaches a lot of importance to Jawi script and Jawi language. And by Javization, I mean that an Islamic scholarly culture based on the use of Malay language and Jawi script became hegemonic or dominant among most Muslim peoples in the region because they came to adopt Jawi Malay as language of religious instruction and also the Jawi script as the primary language of Islamic scholarship besides Arabic. And often local Muslim cultures also began to write their own languages in an adapted Jawi script. So also I would consider Pagon, for example, for Javanese as part of the same trend, which by the 19th century led to a decline in local Islamic literatures in older Southeast Asian scripts, or also to a growing isolation of Islamic literatures in older non-Jawi or non-Arabic based scripts. And this often, I will show, led to conflicts between the agents or the proponents of Javization and the defenders of older local vernacular traditions. So in the end, I would say that Jawi Malay became not just a lingua franca, but what I would call an Islamic supra-language, similar to the role played by Urdu in South Asia or by Swahili language in East Africa, for example. The second main argument is that Cambodia, which is usually not even considered as part of Muslim Southeast Asia, let alone as part of the Malay world, is actually one of the most striking examples of Javization, because in Cambodia, Javization has on the one hand clearly eclipsed contending Islamic traditions based on the Cham script. You see a Cham manuscript here, and Cham is the language of the great majority of Muslims in Cambodia. But Javization has not just eclipsed Islamic literatures in Cham script, but the conflicting forces of Javization and close attachment to the Malay world on the one hand, and anti-Javization on the other hand, have by the late 20th century canalized into two different officially recognized Islamic communities. So in Cambodia, since the 1990s, since the late 1990s, we have two officially registered and officially recognized Islamic communities. One we could call the Muslim mainstream in Cambodia, which is basically Shafi'i, although there is now a growing segment of Salafi Muslims as well. And this mainstream is represented officially by the Mufti of Cambodia, Sos Kamri, and that's already very instructive, who, for example, himself produces books in Cham language, but written in Jawi script. Here is, for example, a prayer manual he produced. The second Muslim community in Cambodia, which is officially recognized, is the so-called Khan Imam San, the Islamic community of Imam San, which is led by its own leading figure, the Oknak Nua or the Onghi Noe. And this community still uses texts and manuscripts written in ancient Cham script, in Akhazra script, and refuses let's say, to any influence by Malay or Jawi models. Now, this paper will be about how this came about, or the book is about how this came about. That now we have 2 officially registered Islamic communities in Cambodia, relying on different scripts and Islamic scholarly traditions. So that's one part. The second question, besides how this happened, is how one among 2 scholarly traditions, which apparently long coexisted with each other, in the end came to largely replace the other. So in a historical perspective, we can say that assumingly in the 19th century, the Cham script tradition and the Malay Jawi tradition, they coexisted. And a very interesting example for this coexistence is this 19th century, mid-19th century manuscript, where we see on the top of the page Cham script. Then we have Arabic with Jawi Malay. And then on the right, there is even a note, perhaps written later, in Jawi Cham. So this for me is a symbol of how these 2 scholarly traditions still coexisted, could even coexist in a single manuscript in the mid-19th century. But as history progressed, we can say that this, for many Cambodian Muslims, became simply the past. So Akhazra Cham script, it was discarded, and the future of Cambodian Islam became Javisation and the usage of Malay materials and the Jawi script. So the story of my book, as I think also Pausef already suggested, it begins in Vietnam and not in Cambodia. It begins with the Champa kingdom, which was for centuries a major kingdom in coastal southern and central Vietnam, which was originally comparable to Java, a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom. However, parts of Cham society, which was of course a maritime, a seafaring people, came to adopt Islam by the 16th century at the latest. However, over the course of several centuries, Champa was gradually swallowed up by Vietnam. So you can see after the late 15th century, the great Champa kingdom was reduced to these 3 regions in the south, which were then also conquered by Vietnam in 1692 and surviving as a vassal state. However, by 1832, there was the complete dissolution of Cham political authority, and it was fully absorbed into the Vietnamese state. This had 2 major consequences. One consequence was that the Muslims in Champa, they more or less lost contact to other Muslims in Java, for example, in the Malay world at large. The second important development was that many Cham Muslims, they fled to and settled to Cambodia and settled down in Cambodia over centuries in different migratory waves. So the major migratory waves, they coincide with Vietnamese military victories. So the late 15th century, the late 17th century, and the early 19th century were major dates for the migration of Cham Muslims to Cambodia. And in Cambodia, these Cham refugees, they interacted with local Malay Muslims who settled down in Cambodia, or Malay sojourners and traders who only resided there on a temporary basis. So in Cambodia, we can assume that there was much interaction with Malay Muslims from the 16th century onwards, whereas in former Champa, the opposite happened. Local Muslims, they largely lost contact to the Muslim world, and therefore a very strongly vernacularized Islamic tradition was developed in former Champa, in present-day Vietnam, which we could say actually canalized into a bi-religious culture in which the dominant part of Cham society in former Champa, they are still Brahmanist Cham, believers in traditional Cham religion, living in a kind of religious symbiosis with a much smaller group of Muslims of a very strongly vernacularized Islamic tradition known as the Cham Bani. Now in Cambodia, as I said, the great majority of Cambodian Muslims, they are ethnic Chams, so they are the descendants of these refugees, of these migrants from Champa. So we could say that 80% of the Muslim population in Cambodia are Chams. The remaining 20% are so-called Chvia, and Chvia has of course the same root as Jawi. It comes from the island of Java, and Chvia Muslims generally claim to be the descendants of Malay settlers. They nowadays speak the local Khmer language and make up approximately 20% of the population. But as I said in the introduction, the most important distinction in Cambodian Islam is not the ethnic one. The important distinction is not between Cham and Chvia Muslims, but the important distinction is between the Muslim mainstream, which underwent the process of Chavization, which accounts for 90% of the local Muslim population, and the remaining 10% are the Khan Imam Sam, who still use ancient Cham script and see themselves as the defenders of a distinctively Cambodian Cham tradition. In addition, there's also nowadays smaller groups of Shi'is and Ahmadi Muslims in Cambodia today. So in the initial stages of the study, I'm talking about the background of Islam in Champa, but also about the background of Malay presence and Malay influence in Cambodia. And I think one of the most important findings is that by the 18th century, when the category of Malayu, of course, already included not just Malays in the narrow sense of the word, but also Bugis, Minangkabaus, Makassaris, and other peoples. It is an important finding that Cambodia was definitely by the 18th century part of the field of activity of main actors in the affairs of the Straits of Malacca region. And it has not been sufficiently appreciated that we find accounts in major Malay literary or historical works like the Hikayat Siak or the famous Tuhfat al-Nafis, or also in the Silsila Melayu dan Bugis, which accounts which provide information on the activities of Malays, Bugis, and Minangkabau in Cambodia. For example, it has been largely of the significance of the fact that the third Yang Tipertuan Muda of Johor, his name is Daeng Cambodia. Why is he called Cambodia? Because his father had been active in Cambodia. Or another case in point is that the Siak Sultan, Raja Ismail, he was preparing himself for an invasion of the port of Ha Tien in present-day Vietnam, for example. So these are some of the Malay sources I also rediscovered, basically, for this study. Also important, beyond these more political and economic aspects of Malay trade and Malay power politics, if you will, was the rise of Islamic scholarship in places like Palembang, in places like Banjarmasin, and especially in Patani and Kelantan, because Patani and Kelantan are, of course, very close to Cambodia. So the rise of Islamic scholarship there more or less automatically had an important influence on what would happen in Cambodia from the year 1800 approximately onwards. In Cambodia itself, so this is a specimen for an important text, for example, by a Patani scholar, which became widely used in Cambodia. In Cambodia itself, by the mid-19th century, we find different factions of Muslims in the sources. We could say that one of these important factions, it was led by people who had the title Set or the title Tun. And this we could translate into Malay as Sayyids and Tuans. So there was one faction calling their leaders Sayyids or Tuans in local form. And this faction was clearly quite closely aligned to the Malay world. On the other hand, there was a second faction, and its leaders usually went by the designation Po. Now, Po is an old Cham title for members of the royal family or of the priestly class. So also the Islamic functionaries of Chambani Islam in Vietnam, they are called Po. So this group, of course, was much stronger attached to the Cham heritage than the other group, which was already more oriented towards the Malay world. Now, the differences between these groups in the mid-19th century, they were apparently mostly political, but apparently there were also some religious aspects involved, which would become more prominent in the subsequent history of Islam in Cambodia. Now, intra-Muslim factionalism, which is also a big part of the book, only became a major issue in the French colonial period, which began in the 1860s. And the growing inter-Muslim factionalism, it really became perceptible around the year 1900. And it was fueled by certain developments. One was that there were constantly growing relationships to the Malay world through visiting and also settling Malay scholars. So here, for example, we see the epitaph of a Malay scholar from Pasir Mas in Kelantan, who died in a Cambodian village in the 1890s. And during the period, there were many like him who came to teach in Cambodia on a temporary basis or even stayed on in Cambodia. So this was one reason for the growing interaction with the Malay world. On the other hand, greater numbers of Cambodian Muslims, they started to study, they went to study in Malay teaching circles in Patani, also in Mecca, but I think most important by the early 20th century was actually Kota Baru in Kelantan, where Cambodian students studied at the Masjid Muhammadi, and there were many suraos and pondoks in Kelantan where Cambodian students came to study. One of them, because of its high number of Cambodian students, was by the 1920s even called Surao Cambodia. And also the teacher there, because he had been teaching in Cambodia as well, earlier on he acquired the name Tok Hassan Cambodia. So also clearly showing how important his transmission of knowledge to Cambodian students was at that time. Another major factor was, of course, the arrival of the printing age. So by the late 19th century and especially by the early 20th century, there was a sudden, much greater availability of literature in Jawi Malay because of the Ottoman Malay printing press in Mecca and because of the activities of Malay publishers of publishers printing Malay books in Cairo, such as the famous Matbaa Mustafa al-Babi al-Halabi. So this was also one aspect, and of course, this combination of factors, it led to an expansion of Islamic schooling based on Jawi models in Cambodia. Now, the chief figures in this transmission of knowledge, or in these networks, it was not a one-sided affair, I would contend, but the chief figures in these networks linking Cambodia and Malay scholarship were all related to a network at whose pinnacle we could say there stood the major Malay mufti in Mecca at the time, Ahmad al-Fatani, who was also the founder of the Ottoman printing press, who put out many of the texts that were then studied in Cambodia. And besides this figure, one of his major students, the famous Kelantanese scholar Tok Kenali, and additionally there were two other important scholarly families involved who were also linked to Tok Kenali and Ahmad Fatani in Kelantan. These were the families of Wan Musa ibn Abdul Samad and the family of Saint Awang. But I do not want to go into the details of these networks now. So the consequence of this close engagement with Jawi scholarship was that also scholars in Cambodia and southern Vietnam began to write works in Malay language. So this, for example, is a text from the 1890s written by a scholar in southern Vietnam, and it even saw the light as a scholarly edition in a French academic journal. So this is a commentary to the al-Barahin of As-Sanusi. Another consequence was that Cambodian scholars, they began to communicate with each other primarily in Jawi Malay. As a case in point, we see here a letter of appointment from the Cambodian Grand Mufti to newly appointed Muslim dignitaries in Pursat in central Cambodia in the 1930s, and it is of course in Jawi Malay. Another important aspect of these relationships was that Cambodian Muslims, they sent fatwa requests to Malay muftis, both in Mecca, but also in Patani and in Kelantan. So here, for example, is a very intriguing fatwa request where Cambodian scholars in the vicinity of Phnom Penh, they wrote to Ahmad Patani about the proper Malay and Cham translations of the divine attribute Kitam or divine pre-existence. So this shows the strong engagement with the Malay language, not just in the existence of the fatwa, but also in the topic of the fatwa. Another case in point would be this fatwa from the 1920s, where also scholars from the vicinity of Phnom Penh, they sent a fatwa request to the journal Pengaso in Kelantan. And we also see in this fatwa request how they were engaging with Jawi texts, because they are referring in this fatwa also to Palimbani's Sayarat Salikin and to Al-Banjari's Sabil al-Muhtadin. This also happened locally. So here, for example, we see a fatwa from the 1930s, also written in Jawi Malay, which was given to local Muslims by a visiting Malay scholar, again from Patani. But as Malay was not the native language of most Cambodian Muslims, this was sometimes also a problem, of course, problems of a language barrier. So interestingly, an accompanying document to this fatwa is here a sheet of paper in which 7 Cambodian scholars, they are officially supporting the reading of the preceding fatwa by the Cambodian Grand Mufti. So this shows that the content of this Malay text or the proper translation of this Malay text was a subject of debate among Cambodian Muslims at that time. Nevertheless, a number of Cambodian scholars became Jawi scholars in their own right. A major example is Muhammad Saleh Kemboja, or Mat Saleh Kemboja, who also studied in Kelantan. And in the 1930s, he published a very important book in Jawi Malay on a very difficult subject, namely on astronomy and on calculating the prayer times and calculating the Qibla. And it was published with accolades by a number of great Malay scholars in Kota Baru in Malaysia. So it's evident that Mat Sales, he became a Jawi scholar in his own right, and also other Cambodian and South Vietnamese scholars. They were important teachers in Kelantan and had local students, local Malay students as well. I think the last important step in this development, after adopting Jawi Malay for communication and for writing books on different subjects, was that there also was a Cham Jawi script developed. So now here we see a specimen of a text which is written in Jawi script, but not in Malay, but in Cham language. So this was, I think, the last step in the Jawisation of Cambodian Muslims. Now, just to take a step back, I was talking about factionalism, which developed because of this increasing Jawisation, because certain parts of the Muslim community, they did not want to go along with it, with these changes it introduced. They want to preserve their older, more vernacularized tradition. So we know from French ethnographic studies that by the 1930s, which was perhaps the high point in Islamic factionalism in Cambodia, there were basically three groups, two of which contended with each other, whereas the third one was pretty much on the sidelines of the conflict. So by the 1930s, the largest group, making up around 2/3 of the Muslim community, they were the agents and proponents of Jawisation. They were using mostly Malay texts in religious education and Arabic and Malay in ritual contexts. And their name, Trimeu, it was supposedly derived from debates over correct marriage formulas. Now, the contending group, already very much on the defensive in the 1930s, it claimed to use only Arabic, but of course also local languages, at least for oral transmission of knowledge in religion education and in ritual. Also, their name, Kobul, is supposedly derived from the same debates over marriage formulas. Now, historically, this group was eventually mostly absorbed into the Jawi current. So Jawisation clearly became the dominant process. At that time, however, there was also a third group labeled as the traditionalists, or the most traditional, and they were still using Cham script in religious education and Arabic and Cham in ritual. And it was this community which was very much detached from the conflict, which eventually came to form the Khan Imam San community of today. Now, as I said, French scholars related that the names of these contending groups, they were derived from debates over the marriage ritual, but there was never like any internal evidence for this. So apart from French ethnographers who related this fact, it could not be confirmed by intra-Muslim sources. So for me, one of the best findings of the study was that I found a fatwa from around 1900, again by Ahmad al-Fatani, and it is also a fatwa in response to a request from Cambodia. And in this, in the Istifta, Cambodian Muslims are asking about what would be the correct expression of consent in a marriage ritual according to the majority of Malay scholars. And they were asking if saying Kabul la hamba would be correct, but already suggesting that they themselves are using a contending expression. And the expression they were using is not saying Kabul la hamba, but terima. So that's the solid evidence for the fact that really the root of these names, Trimeu from terima, and Kabul from Kabul, were these debates about the marriage rituals. Yeah, this shows, of course, in religious factionalism, there's often certain areas which became the most emblematic factors, and in this case, the marriage ritual or the declaration of consent in the marriage ritual became the most emblematic issues, because the Kabul claimed that their formula was an Arabic formula, although it was initially perhaps also derived from Malay, whereas the proponents of the Terima wording, they took their formula from Jawi prayer manuals, for example, by Dawood al-Fatani. Finally, it should be mentioned that also French colonial policies played a role in helping gaining Chavization, in helping Chavization to gain the upper hand in Cambodia, and that is because the French authorities, they had certain assumptions about how real Islam should look like. And for the colonial authorities, they simply primarily and routinely regarded Islamic schools in the country plainly as Malay ones. So when they in the 1930s introduced official guidelines for the examination and certification of personnel in primary Islamic schools, which they called Malay schools, they simply wrote that a part of the examination should be to write a text in Malay characters. And by Malay characters, of course, they meant Jawi, Malay. And this precondition for the examinations, of course, excluded any usage of the ancient Cham script. Now I will come to the end of my presentation to leave time for questions. I will very much leave out the history after the 1950s or after the French colonial period. We could say that Chavization clearly became the dominant process in Cambodia until the 1970s. Then came the civil war, the rule of the Khmer Rouge, which was very devastating for the Cambodian Muslims. So this was a period of trial for the Cambodian Muslims for at least 2 decades. Only in the 1990s, after many Jawi scholars had been killed by the Khmer Rouge, could the community start on rebuilding its structures. But we could say that to a certain extent, as we also saw in the figure of the Cambodian Grand Mufti, the tradition of Chavization has been preserved. So Malay, even though now often in Roman script, is still a very important language of Islamic scholarship for Cambodian Muslims, even though now Arabic is getting more and more important, also because, for example, in the Salafi schools, it is only Arabic texts which are used, or texts in the local languages, mostly in Khmer, in the national language, and no Malay literature is used. Nevertheless, we can see the resilience of this attachment to the Malay world in the last major instances of Islamic factionalism in Cambodia, which took place in the early 2000s, where there was quite severe conflicts between the growing Salafi element and the also growing, recently introduced Tablighi Jamaat movement. And interestingly, the Tablighi Jamaat, with its close relationship to Tablighi centers in Yala, in southern Thailand, and again in Kelantan, they very much presented themselves as the defenders of the older heritage of Chavization vis-a-vis the more Arabic-focused Salafis. So this will be it from my overview over the book, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Philipp, for an insightful presentations. The research
period starting from the late 19th centuries, when the Islamization process took place, and then continuing into the early 20th century. And it also experienced a shift following the presence of modern Middle Eastern Islamic forces. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind you to please kindly fill the attendance form in the link provided by the committee in the chat box so you can get a certificate for the seminar. I'm sure many of the participants here want to drop questions to the presentations, but please kindly drop the question on the chat box and save it to ask directly after the second speaker. So to discuss about this book, we are also pleased to have Professor Jajat Burhanudin. He is a lecturer at the Faculty of Adab and Humanities, Seri State Islamic University, Jakarta. He earned his bachelor's degree in Islamic history, a master's and PhD in Islamic studies from Leiden University. He is also a Fulbright visiting scholar program in the year 2019. Also, he is one of the editors of Studia Islamika and the former director of PPIM Wien, Jakarta. And I'm sure Professor Jajat is already excited to share his view on this book. Prof. Jajat, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Terima kasih banyak. I'm Philipp. I'm glad to see you now. Bisa dengar suara saya atau kurang jelas nggak?
Ya, sudah terdengar, sudah jelas.
Okay. Wow. Actually, it's very difficult to talk after Philipp because he give a comprehensive study about the subject, Cambodia Muslim, which for Indonesian people is not so familiar with. I myself, for instance, have no knowledge so much about Cambodia. And when I read the books, I found some difficulties understanding some local, local context of Islam in Cambodia, because I don't know Cambodia. But anyway, I will start with saying that congratulations for your book, Philipp. It's a really great book and it's very comprehensive. I think it is the first book which I have read about Cambodia, which is very comprehensive explanation about Muslim minority. So that's why I have no substantial question about Churbu actually. You approach that minority with from Islamic issue like Jawisation, and that's why there's no impression that, for instance, there's a majority and the minority, center and periphery. There's not such thing in your book because you approach from the way they engage in the Islamic issue, the Jawisation. The Muslim Cambodia study Jawi and then write in Jawi language, and then also studying in school in Ranta and Patani, the main word of Islam. They make kind of network for Islamization in Cambodia. So, but I want to say another thing. Let me share screen. Okay. Okay. What I'm going to say is that your period in the study of Cambodia, 19th century and the early 20th century, before the modern period about Islamization, you are in the period of what I say text pattern in Central Asia. So there are a lot of texts, Malay, Jawi, Kitab Jawi text.
Excuse me, Pak Jajat, would you please to show it in sorry, yeah, that one.
Yeah. Okay.
Not yet.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, already. Thank you.
So I will say that 11th century, prior to the study of your Cambodia Muslim and Patani and Malay state, Kelantan, for instance, and also Terengganu. It is when the Kitab Jawi was everywhere. I mean, not the Kitab Jawi, but also Kitab Kuning, which is now Kitab Kuning recently. There are a lot of texts in Southeast Asia, Islamic texts. So that's why I would say that this Islamic text was done in Southeast Asia. There are some points I want to say that perhaps you are familiar with knowledge production on the Jawa and Mecca in the century. There are a lot of Kitab Jawi written by the Jawi ulama in Mecca. And I think from my survey, at least Kitab Jawi at least, I think almost all Kitab Jawi 19th century written by Malay ulama in Mecca, not in South Asia. It's different, for instance, from the period of Araniri and for instance Lasikili. They wrote their works in Aceh, in the Kingdom of Aceh, but later on, 19th century, they wrote their work in Mecca. So, so Mecca become I think Mecca become the center of knowledge production some of the time. So all the work almost directed for Malay audience, but I think they subject relevant with the current discourse in Mecca at the time. We have also, I think, to mention the printing press. So this transformation from manuscript into printed books, because Kitab Jawi are books actually, not manuscript. Although they are manuscript version, for instance, if you go to Malaysia and later there are a lot of manuscript version of the book which are now printed in Southeast Asia. Printed in Mecca and printed in Al-Harabi in Egypt and also in Bombay and also in Southeast Asia. I think that's I will explain later about Ahmad Wahab because he's the one who has, I think, strong network with the publisher in the Middle East. That's why so many books from Patani were printed in the Middle East at that time. But I'll read later. Another thing I want to say is that there's a kind of, how to say, the willingness of the author from Malay to render them some of the content of the books in Jawi. So it's kind of a response of the ulama of Jawi ulama of Mecca from Malay segment to try to write their work in Jawi. I quote from Daur Abatan in Dur Al-Samin, 19th century, but actually it's also the same as Amdi Pansuri in the 16th century when he wrote Sharb al-Salikin. Sharb al-Asikin, who also said that I do it to write the book in Malay because not so many people know Arabic and Persian. So that's why to make the book can be comprehended by people who know Arabic. I wrote it in Malay or in Jawi. So this is something I think special in the context of Malay or Jawi book or the Kitab Jawi, because it's never stated in the Kitab Kuning of Arabic. Like for instance, the book by Kitab by Nawal Bantani. He never mentioned about this kind of statement because he invited a lot of people, I mean, pesantren to know Arabic with the Arabic, and that's why, and also he doesn't provide them with the book in Kitab in Jawi or in Japanese language, it just like in Arabic. So I will say that this is the issue which I think led to what I said is the spectral turn in South Asia in the 19th century and the early 20th century. The context of Kitab Jawi, for instance, I have it is the book of Fikih. I'm getting on Fikih. There, the number is quite high in the 19th century. Before that, we had only 3 Kitab Jawi that can be identified as belonging to 17th and the 18th century. The first one was Surah Mustaqim by Raniri. It was from 17th century. Nasingkili Beratulab, also same period, later on. And then we have Sabil Muhtadin by Muhammad Ashraf Anjari, was mentioned earlier by Philipp. And the book is commentary to Surah Mustaqim, because the introduction of the book said that so many Achanese language in Surah Mustaqim, and people would not understand properly about Achanese language, because the book are in Malay actually, Aceh, and Banjari tried to make a kind of commentary. 2 volumes Kitab Sabah Muhtadin, and I saw it from the every point he discussed is very much referred to Sirat al-Mustaqim by Arani. In 19th century, this is a big book. There are a lot of texts. Not only about fiqh, also about theology, about akidah, also about Sufism. Based on the book, some I think there are a lot of other book by Dara Patani, but this the book on fiqh, which much more available for the Muslim at that time compared to pre-19th century. Where Pura Masail, because in my opinion, is also a kind of response to the issue like Al-Banjari mentioned in Sabil Muhtadin. 2 volumes, and the second volume is very much related to the issue of economic and politics and muamalah, not ibadah. Bughyatul also 2 volumes, 100 pages. There's also written by Adab Patani, and mostly about Vicky, Najarogi bin, mostly about muamalah. Strong Tadi is kind of introduction to Islamic knowledge about many aspects, but mostly about Vicky. Nida, as you mentioned by Philipp, specific about Nikah, and the last one is about the Al-Faraid, inheritance. It's only that Al-Patani, but there are a lot of Al-Patani scholars like Ahmad Al-Patani and Muhammad Jalal Al-Patani's father, Ahmad Al-Patani, who also wrote Kasif Al-Itam, also 2 volume book about fiqh. So, I'm not talking about fiqh, but if you see, for instance, about the Aqidah, there are a lot of books about Sifat 20, which also available. A lot of written by, at least I think, yeah, there's a commentaries to Al-Sanusi mentioned by Philipp. At least I found around 6 kitab, which are commentary to that small kitab by Al-Sanusi. So that's why in the context of Aqidah, Sifat 20 is the kind of, how to say, perhaps a popular formulation of Sunni doctrine in Southeast Asia, because it's very well known. When I was a kid, I was also asked my father to memorize this kind of Sifat 20, like wajib, I forget, from Sifat 20, wujud kidam baku, and so on and so forth. Besides Fiqh and Aqidah, we have also books about Sufism, and also by Ghazali is the triumphs of Sufism, because a lot of books, like for instance, the book by Dora Batani also wrote, translated, commented a bit about Mizal Abidin by Al-Ghazali. And before that, we have Al-Palembani, who wrote a lot about Sufism of Al-Ghazali. Yes, Sirah Salikin is powerful you of the book about Al-Ghazali. So for this reason, I will say that what we say about the Islamic Orthodoxy in Asia is, I think, pretty much related to the growth of Kitab Jawi and Kitab Kuning as well in 19th century. It's not from 17 or 16, but it must be, I think, from 19th century, when that Kitab studied in Pesantren, translated into Malay Jawi, and so translated into Japanese language. Like, for instance, we have the ulama in Sarah Japa, which make a translation of the book of Kitab by Al-Ghazali. In the context of Indonesia, there's a kind of colonial factor for the rise of Kitab. It's different person from French in Cambodia. Here in Indonesia, we have a bit Romisation. I mean, I will say colonial political Romisation. It's the Dutch government actually they don't, or at least they prohibit to maybe they how to say, avoid the growth of the use of Arabic script, including the Kitab Jawi. It is related to Karl Friedrich Holle. He's a Dutch scholar actually, who was working in West Java. He attempted to grow the Priangan elite away from Islamic or any kind of Arab-Islamic element. So that's why he recommended the Penghulu use Latin script to replace the way the Arabs use Arabic script. So I don't know, but I think the reason why the Pesantren becomes so much studying the Kitab, Arabic Kitab, and also perhaps some Kitab Jawi, it also related to the colonial context, where there's a kind of factionalism, we will say, between Kaum Santri and Kaum Priai. The Kaum Priai was supported by the Dutch colonial government. And the Kitab and the Arabic script is not just script, but also it has something ideology among the people group in Indonesia at the time. It's different as well from, I think, Malaysia, where that's kind of policy. I mean, the colonial policy is not so much like Dutch in the Indies. British is much more relaxed. I mean, not so much has a problem with Muslim or Islamic affairs like Dutch had in the Indies. And Cambodia is, from my reading from book by Philipp, is this colonial also factor for the rise of, or at least for the enhancement of the Jawi book or Jawisation. I like to say about the surau, also related to the technical terms I said in the earlier. I just found data that show the Kitab used or circulate within surau. Because surau now is not any longer as a center of Islamic learning since 19th century. sorry, in the early 20th century, because those who are modernized also are transformed into modern schools. So that's why surau doesn't exist any longer as institutions, as a learning institution. But in 19th century, I found the data we could list about the kitab used in surau, and all kitab are almost the same with the kitab kuning studied studied by Panumber and Martin Mabunasan. Then we knew that data about the kitab in pesantren. All the kitab by Arabic, almost the same as kitab kuning, which we know in pesantren. And there's no kitab Jawi, unfortunately. All the book are in Arabic, all the kitab in Arab. And like for instance, the book by Mijhail Talibin mentioned by Nawawi is also there. Then Alfiya, Jurumiyah, language is also there in the list. And so with that, I will say that surau is full-fledged Islamic learning center at the time. And I think this data is very much important because I just found here in Leiden and I'm doing it, which I think is a new information about the surau. We know surau a lot, but no one mentioned about the kitab used in surau, and this I think enhance or maybe strengthen the picture about how the Islamic text also situated in the surau in Minangkabau. Surprisingly, actually, Minhaj Talibin is book by now. Actually, it was in the list, and also in the list in provided by Panumber in Java in pesantren. And I'm sure that there was a printed version of this book, but in Minangkabau, I found two manuscript version of the kitab Minhaj Talibin. It is the Fikih books, which is a leading Fikih book, I think, in Muslim world, and also in the pesantren and surau. So the book are very well. We have kitab Jawi, we also a lot. We have also in pesantren and surau, and so in Daya in Aceh, the book in Arabic language, and also there's a translation of some Arabic texts into Japanese by Selain Darat, but it was not in pesantren, also in Japanese community, Muslim community. So what I will say that's the condition, I think, to explain why and how the Cambodian Muslim engage in Jawisation, engage in Islamic super language at the time. If I quote the wording of Philipp, Islamic super language at the time, and because Arabic and Malay became the dominant language of Islam during the 19th century. I invite Philipp to talk about Jawisation. In context of, for instance, non-Malay areas in Asia, how it's Jawisation or maybe Japanisation of Arabic script. In Java, for instance, Arabic script or Japanese language, so they just took script, not the language. In Makassar, for the Islamic, Bugis, Islamic, and the script. So a specific area which different person from Sumatra and Kalimantan or Borneo. Actually, it's almost the same as you mentioned about the Kabul and how to say, Kabul and three sections. So I found it the same in context of of South Asia. So that's why I found some of the same actually. What happened about the script, not only in Cambodia, but also in many parts of South Asia. So it's kind of support the theory about Jawisation. Perhaps you have another issue about that is that particular point. I actually invite you to speak again about Jawisation because it's a very much interests me. That term. I also need to mention about Avatani. It's very well known. It's influential in Cambodia. I also read about Avatani, some about Patawa Avatani, and I found a lot of questions from Jawi, as you mentioned earlier, and I think it is the only script, the only text which from Mecca who talk about Cambodia. So that's why he has a lot network, much than other ulama or Patani or Malaysian ulama or maybe Jawi ulama in general to the people minority group in Cambodia. So that I think the some point that I want to share with you. I have sequential question about your book because I agree with all points you explained, and again congratulate from your fascinating book published by Brill. Dita, I think this is the end of my presentation. I know it's not so much comprehensive, but I just make some point I'm doing now in my study. Thank you. Demikian. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jajat, for an excellent presentation. It's interesting to know the history of Kitab Kuning, Kitab Jawi, that the kitab is developed comprehensively. So it's easier for us to read now. I remember when I was a child, I also studied about that, a little bit about Kitab Kuning, and I never know that its development is quite complex. So I believe here many participants also want to ask more about the topic. To ask directly to the research person here, we encourage you to please click the raise hands on the reaction tab. And is there anyone want to ask to the research person? Please kindly raise your hand, or you can also drop the questions on the chat box. I will also look for in the YouTube channel. Is there any questions? But to begin the Q&A session here, I would like to bring out the topic that was mentioned by Prof. Jajat in the end of his presentations about the, would you please, Dr. Philipp, to elaborate more about the Jawi session?
Okay, yes. Firstly, I want to say that the overview on the textual turn, I appreciate it a lot. Because I also think that the main aspect of the era of Jawisation was the transition from oral to mostly written tradition. So this was one important process that happened, and the vehicle of this process in many places was Malay, or at least the Jawi script, and also for me very important comparative cases where Minangkabau and Java, even though the closer interactions of the Cambodian Muslim were with Patani, Kelantan, and Terengganu. I think that, and this is the connection to the broader theme of Jawisation. The third very important comparative case for me was Lombok, with the different factional identities of Wetu Telu and Baktu Lima, basically. Because also in Lombok we see that a small segment of the Muslim population, it has remained under the name of Wetu Telu, and they still use Sasak language, they still use texts in Sasak script, texts in Javanese script, whereas the great majority, it has come now in the present sense to adopt Malay, meaning Bahasa Indonesia, even if written in Rumi nowadays, but still I think that's the same process. The major difference, of course, is that in Cambodia, the anti-Jawi group, the Kani Mansan, they even are now officially registered, whereas a group like the Vetutelu and similar groups, of course, are not. So I think the intriguing part of Javisation is, of course, not that speakers of Malay language, they experience the textual turn, but I think, although this is also important and was an important precondition, but the really important issue is that non-Malays came to adopt it. And that's, there's, of course, many more examples than just the Chams, especially also many examples in present-day Indonesia. But of course, there's also some counter cases, which Jajat brought out very well. So we still have a written tradition in Makassarese or Bugis script. Also, Javanese, even though Javanese script was very much discarded, it continued to be used as an Islamic scholarly language in Pagan, so Arabic script based. But nevertheless, we also see that in Java, Jawi Malay was also important. So we have, I think, one of the most striking cases is a scholar like Sayyid Uthman al-Alawi. So he was actually very proud of being a Hadrami, of being an Arab, or at least an Arab of mixed descent. But he was living on Java in Batavia, but most of his output was not in Arabic, but in Jawi Malay. And I think he didn't write in Javanese at all, because he was also presumably not fluent in Javanese. So even though there are certain counter cases, I would still think that the dominant process was the adoption of Malay, also for non-Malay speakers like the Chams or the Minangkabau, the Bugis. Aceh is another case. Achenese was and is still used also in writing. But as we saw in the prominent examples from earlier centuries, the major scholars who wanted their works to be read more widely, they like Ranieri, like Sinkili, they wrote in Jawi Malay and not in Achenese or Arabic, because I think the important point is that still Cham and the other Malayo-Polynesian languages, they are after all related to Malay, and also the Malayo-Polynesian speaking peoples, they are culturally related to Malay. So it is only natural that even though it was a foreign language, it was a language much more easily accessible than Arabic, of course. So still we know that in the end, the ideal was to study in Arabic. But many people could not reach this final stage. So they stayed with the Jawi texts, which were already in a foreign language. So it was also the vehicle which brought different communities together, different language communities of Southeast Asian Muslims, which Michael Leffen, for example, calls the Jawi ecumene. And I think it is important to see that also the great majority of Muslims in Cambodia and southern Vietnam, they are part of the Jawi ecumene, and therefore also are an inextricable part of Muslim Southeast Asia.
Okay, thank you very much. Here, there is one person who already raised hand, Miss Ida Rosida. Would you please turn on your mic and your video?
Yeah, hello, good evening in US. I think Professor Philipp in US.
It's morning actually, because I'm based in Austria. So for me, it's Selamat Pagi. For you, it's Selamat Sore.
Oh, okay. So good morning. Yeah, Ms. Dita, I would like to ask to Professor Philipp, to Dr. Philipp. Yeah, thank you for the time. Very interesting to see the history of Islam in Cambodia since ancient times. Yeah, and especially knowing from your presentation that in Cambodia, there are also those who use Arabic, Malay, and written by Jawi script. Or even there is a history about the Bugis. As you might know that there is also Bugis in Indonesia. Yeah, and my question is, during your research and experience in Cambodia, do you ever found any handwriting scripts? And if yeah, have you seen it by yourself? And how is the condition of this book? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ida.
You mean manuscripts in Bugis or in any language?
In Cambodia, I mean.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, there is still there are still collections of Islamic manuscripts in Cham script, so the older script, not the Jawi one, because these are preserved by the so-called Khan Imam San community. So for them, the old manuscripts, they are very important part of their identity, we could say, and therefore they have been preserving these manuscripts until today in private collections. And because they could get funding from different sides, for example, from the US Embassy and from other organizations, they also digitized some of their manuscripts and then made copies out of the digitized manuscripts and used them for Islamic schooling. So it is, we could say that by the early 2000s, they developed a new or revived schooling system in ancient Cham script within the Khan Imam San community, and because they got foreign funding. But here it's important to say that they did not get foreign funding from Muslim organizations, because most Muslim organizations, they wanted to convert them to proper Islam or Orthodox Islam, how they would see it, because the Khan Imam San, I forgot to mention, they have very particular, a few specific ritual particularities. For example, they do not pray 5 times a day, but only on Friday. That's why the majority of Cambodian Muslims also calls them Kaum Jumat, for example. So most Islamic manuscripts in Cambodia which have been preserved are in Cham script, in Akhar Sra script, and circulating in the Khan Imam San community. But on the other hand, I also found some manuscripts in Cham Jawi, but they are of a lesser number actually. And the condition varies. So some of the manuscripts are still in very good condition, although we know in the tropics, like in Indonesia, it's a very dangerous climate for manuscripts. But yeah, because they were very strongly guarded by the communities, some of them are still in surprisingly good conditions, whereas others are, of course, quite bad. Yeah.
May I have another question? Just a short one. And yeah, any supporting document for your book that use handwritten book?
I'm sorry, I didn't understood the question.
Do you use any handwritten book for your published book?
I see, yes. Yeah, I used different handwritten sources. So on the one hand, I used, for example, handwritten archival documents, which I found in the Cambodian National Archives, like some of the handwritten fatwas I showed, and also this sheet of paper which testified to the transmission, to the translation of the fatwa by the Grand Mufti. So for one part, there's written documents from the National Archives. They are mostly in Jawi Malay. And then I also used some of the Cham manuscripts. But my big disadvantage is that I don't read the ancient Cham script. So I could not access these. I'm a Jawi scholar myself, if you will, and not a scholar in Achasra script. So I only could access these texts with the help of local scholars. So when I was using handwritten materials, they were mostly in Jawi Malay and from the Cambodian National Archives or from private collections.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Ida. And you can also read the full book. Maybe if you want to know which script, maybe Philipp already mentioned in the presentation. And maybe another one want to ask questions, please click the reaction tab and you can find the raise hand feature on that tab. And you can also drop your questions on the chat box. Here from the presentations, I'm curious about whether the Islamizations in Cambodia has the same pattern with the Islamizations in the common Malay word. Maybe Prof. Jajat can explore more.
Well, I think about Cambodia should be Philipp who know about that, but at least to some extent, I think actually Cambodia became Muslim because of Malay. I mean, they have a good connection with the Malay. Patani is one of the area or one of the region actually. One of the center of Islamic learning because Patani has a pondok, and I think pondok in Malaysia also came from Patani, I suppose. I don't know if it might be clear or not, but because when there was a migration of Patani scholar from Patani to Terengganu to Kelantan and to some area in Malaysia that today Malaysia because of the Siam's attack to Patani Kingdom, and then they built pondok. For instance, in the area in Terengganu, it's a well-known Putu Duyung, if I'm not mistaken, where the leading alim of Patani established pondok in that area. And I think from then, pondok is a well-known kind of established Islamic center of learning, traditional Islamic learning in the whole area of Malay area. Malay's area in South Asia. So from that kind of thing, then Islamization began, and Philipp then mentioned about the engagement of with the familiarity of Cambodia into Jawi language because of the connection with texts from Patani and Kelantan, also from the ulama from Patani and some other area in South Asia. Yeah, it is actually, I don't know. Actually, I have a question to Philipp about the Kitab Kuning. Do you think Kitab Kuning is part of the Kitab Jawi? Because I found big difference in terms of writing. I mean, if you go to Nawal Bantan, it's what a Sarah, to the Sarah Kitab of Christian ulama. And the writing about the publishing, about the printing style also different. Because if you look at, for instance, the Kitab Jawi, what is inserted in the margin is not the book commented on by that kitab. It's not the book. For instance, it's only unless Sabah Muhtadin, I think in the version published by Cairo, late in 1930, In the margin was Sirah Mustaqim. But the rest, like the book by kitab by Patani, Darul Patani, Abah Patani, and so many Patani ulama which I have studied. In the margin is not the book they commented on. It's another kitab which not somehow still related, but not the book they commented on. And I think it also happened with the book on Sifat 20. For instance, book by Al-Asi from Aceh about Siraj al-Huda, Bidatul Hidayah, for instance. There's a book inserted in the margin, but not the kitab by Asanusi, but kitab by another al-ulama. And I think this is style of printing is quite different from kitab kuning, at least by Nawal Bantani, where the kitab inserted in the text inserted in the margin is the kitab they commented on. For instance, I'm sorry, I forget the name, but just the mode of the style of the writing of the kitab Jawi, the kitab kuning. Yeah, maybe we can say this kind of another kind of Jawi, kitab Jawi, which is in Arabic. Maybe my question is because now today, if you look at Indonesia, pesantren is much more become the leading center of Islamic learning, widespread in many areas. In Sumatra, now we have pesantren, Kalimantan we have pesantren, and so many pesantren. There's a kind of pesantrenization in many areas in Java, Indonesia now. And kitab kuning is very much influential compared to kitab Jawi. Kitab Jawi is not so much accessible any longer in Muslim learning in Indonesia. So how you respond to that condition about kitab in Indonesia? And last one, I think I'm curious to know about the Islamization in Cambodia. Are you optimistic that Jawisation still exists today in next few years in Cambodia? If you look at Indonesia, we have now a kind of Islam Nusantara, which basically actually refers to the Islam in the 19th century, where kitab Jawi dominate very much in the knowledge production in the Islamic learning. And we try to kind of reconstruct this kind of historical realities from the 19th century to counter the Salafism. Because basically the word Islam Nusantara is formulated recently is to counter the Salafism. So what happened in Cambodia? Because not now it's not Jawisation actually, it's much more Malayization. I mean, because Malaysian agent, NGO and state like Kelantan Pension made a lot of undertaking to I don't know, maybe to Islamize Cambodia. Even though I think Malaysian is not so much against Salafism, just like Indonesia. Indonesia is very much against Salafism, and Malaysia, I don't think it is so much. I mean, there's much more. Maybe to some extent they agree with Salafism, I suppose. So I think this my question about your book, Philipp. I mean, about the situation in Malaysia and also in Indonesia and also in Cambodia. Now, can you just address some of the issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think it's basically three different issues which are all interrelated and also connected to Dita's question. So talking about Islamization, I would say it depends how we use Islamization. If we are speaking about a quantitative Islamization, that is people adopting Islam, becoming Muslims, or a qualitative Islamization, that is people becoming more recognizably Islamic. So as far as the earlier quantitative Islamization is concerned, I would say that the Chams, it was just part of the same process as the rest of the Malay world. It was a common process of Islamization, and I think that in the history of Champa, perhaps the connection to the Javanese Pasisir was more important initially than to Patani and Kelantan, for example, because we know that there are these stories which say that Islam was brought to Java from Champa. And the question is not if this is historically correct or not, but it shows that in the earliest history of Islam in both Java and in Champa, there must have been a strong connection, and Patani Kelantan, it only became very important, let's say, from the 18th century onwards, because that was also when they became important centers of Islamic scholarship. So now I think there is a tendency by Cham scholars, but also by Malay scholars, to project this further back into the past, you know, to think that Kelantan was always the most important point of reference in the Malay world for Cham Muslims. But I think this only happened later. Before, perhaps Java was even more important, or other places. So as far as the question of the differences between Kitab Kuning and Kitab Jawi is concerned, I would say that at times the situation which Jajat described very nicely is the result of editorial policy of the publishers. So I think whereas the Kitab Kuning, they were still very much in the traditional framework of having a matan and a sharh, and then a hashia to the sharh. So it was only natural that both the hashia and the sharh were contained on the same page. This makes perfect sense. But the Kitab Jawi, they were usually already a condensation of Arabic scholarship. So I think the editorial policy was not to include earlier base texts, but rather to spread as many authoritative texts as possible. So that's why they rather choose to have, for example, a text on fiqh by Dawood al-Fatani, and in the margin, perhaps a text by the same author, but on Sufism, because the important part was to spread as many authoritative texts in one volume as possible. And to a certain extent, this editorial policy was later also adopted by Arabic publishers. For example, I found out that many Malay scholars, they taught Tafsir al-Nasafi. And I thought, why were they teaching Tafsir al-Nasafi? It is a tafsir of a Hanafi Maturidi background. So it was not the most likely choice for someone to teach in Southeast Asia. And then I found out that over centuries, the Tafsir al-Khasin, it had been popular in Southeast Asia. And the Tafsir al-Khasin then was published in a combined edition with the Tafsir al-Nasafi in the margin. So it's the same. These texts are unrelated tafsirs, but they were published together. And that's why Jawi scholars of Kitab Kuning, they started to teach and study both of them. So often it's also editorial policy. And I would say that now we have reached another stage. So the period of Javisation with Kitab Jawi, it lasted mainly from the beginning of the textual turn until, let's say, the area of independence. And I think now we have reached a different stage. So as a supra language, of course, Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Melayu are still, because of the national frameworks, the dominant ones. But what is being taught in the institutions of Islamic learning are mostly the Kitab Kuning and no longer any Kitab Jawi, and this applies to Malaysia as well. And I think this is again a part of qualitative Islamization. So now say, okay, we don't need the intermediary stage. We don't need the linkage through Jawi books anymore. We'll just go straight to the Arabic ones. And then this is the link also to the last question. What's the state of affairs in Cambodia today? And I would say it is similar. So as a cultural background, Jawi, Malay is still very important. But on the other hand, the Salafis are mostly young scholars. So they don't share in this cultural background anymore. They grow up perhaps still speaking Cham, but many of them also no longer speak Cham, but they only speak Khmer. And what they study in the Salafi schools is a curriculum with some translations of works into Khmer, in Khmer script, but mostly they study exclusively Arabic texts. And on the other hand, the non-Salafi spectrum, as Jajat said, is very strongly influenced by Malaysia, and they closely related to curricula of Al-Azhar, for example. But this also means that the connection to Malay, the knowledge of Malay language to engage with Malay institutions of education and so on is very important, but the texts used are mostly in Arabic. So it's very much the same thing. And the question is, if the Salafi challenge is perceived as so threatening that one has to respond with a kind of Islam Nusantara. And I think this question is in Cambodia still open. So there was really strong conflict in the late 1990s, early 2000s, but it subsided. So now we could say that the Salafis and the Shafis, they try to stay out of each other's way. They have their own institutions, and there is not so much open conflict, but this might change in the future. So I would say it is still open. And as I said, the Tablighi Jamaat, which became the most successful Islamic mass movement in Cambodia, they very much capitalized on the Salafi challenge because also they introduced new rituals, new perspectives, new teachings, but they could frame their teachings, even though they were new, as the prolongation of an older Malay Jawi tradition and as the anti-Salafism per se. So that's the state of affairs today, and I think it is still open how it will develop in the future.
Thanks, Philipp.
Thank you for the great question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is there anyone here want to ask directly to Mr. Philipp? So if there is no one here, I have a question maybe for Pak Philipp. There is a story that Wali Songo, like Sunan Ampel, Sunan Gunung Jati, have a relations with Champa. Could we find that in the manuscript of Champa to prove this story, or maybe your finding maybe that can prove this story is true?
As far as I know, these reports are only preserved in Javanese sources. So of course, I'm not a specialist on the ancient Cham manuscripts, but of course I went through the library catalogs and everything, and I didn't find any similar sources on these stories. But as I said, there's other indicators which to me strongly suggest that there was initially a strong engagement with Java, also because we have the same Chinese connection. So there is this debate on how important Sino-Javanese were in the spread of Islam in the coastal towns. And we have the same in the early period in Champa. So some of the most important Muslim families in southern Chinese ports, they were Sino-Chans. So they moved back because of the expansion of Vietnam in Champa. They moved to China, but they were of a shared Chinese Chan heritage, and they were Muslim. So also I think we have here a connection. And of course we find many types of literature. For example, Java, very prominent was, of course, the Serat Menak, the story of Amir Hamza. And also in the old manuscripts from Champa, the story of Amir Hamza is very, very important. Even one of the characters of the story, Anushirwan, the contender of Amir Hamza, because of the prominence in these manuscripts, he is not only an important figure in Muslim Champani Islam, in former Champa, but he was even introduced into the religion of the Brahmanist Chams. Of course, Amir Hamza was also distributed in Malay, just like the story of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, which is also prominent in old Cham texts. But still, I see a very strong Javanese connection, even though if we don't see the same kind of chronicles speaking of the introduction of Islam from Champa to Java, also on the Cham side.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe last questions, maybe from participant here.
Okay,
So,
I want to ask.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Pak Philipp and Prof. Jajat. Okay, I want to ask to Pak Philipp about Islamic religious, Prof. And how to religious education curriculum is structured by Cambodia government. And the last question, what is the focus of Islamic teaching in Cambodia? Like in Indonesia, Islamic institution in Indonesia focus on maybe Hafiz, reading Al-Quran, like it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So as far as the first question is concerned, the Cambodian government does not interfere in Islamic education. So Islamic education is provided outside of the government schools. But there's, of course, now also many Islamic schools which have an integrated curriculum. So they are teaching the national curriculum and the Islamic subject. So there, on this level, there is hardly any interference by the government. Also, for example, if you compare the situation with my country of origin, for example, where we nowadays have laws, for example, barring little children from wearing headscarves, the Cambodian government has done very much the opposite. So the Cambodian government, it has given a decree in which it has enshrined the right for Muslim pupils to wear the headscarf at school. So on this level, the position of the government towards the Muslim minority is quite positive. This also means, on the other hand, that, for example, the Salafi organizations from Kuwait, from Saudi Arabia, they were also very free to practice their dawah and practice and open institutions of learning, mosques, and so on. So as I said, there is very little government interference, but of course it is an autocratic state. So for example, every hakem, that is the religious mosque leader or village leader, he has to be part of the ruling CPP party to exercise his function. So there is a compulsory political subservience in this respect. But as I said, very little interference or perhaps even no interference with Islamic education as such. So as the focus of Islamic education is concerned, yeah, you are perfectly right. I think it is similar than in Indonesia, or also similar than schooling among Islamic schooling among Muslims. In Austria, it starts with what I would call Quran alphabetization. So the Alif Ba type, then comes a recitation, and of course the necessary knowledge in ritual law, that is praying. So it is no coincidence that the first work published by the Cambodian Grand Mufti was a prayer manual. So it starts with the rules in Ibadat, and then it continues. And of course, there is certain differences to the type of books used in the mainstream and in the Salafi spectrum. Of course, where they are mostly using the well-known, important modern Salafi authors and even Taymiyyah and others. The most striking different case is, of course, the education within the Khan Imam San community, because, of course, also their Quran alphabetization is very important. But there, a major part of the education is, of course, teaching the children the Cham script and reading also old Cham poetry and things like this.
Okay, thank you so much, Philipp.
Thank you to Mrs. Tati. And that question marks the end of the discussion for today. We would like to express our appreciation to all distinguished speakers, Pak Philipp and also Pak Jajat. Thank you very much. And also thank you very much for all the participants here for joining this event. We are delighted to inform you that the book review article on this book, on Pak Philipp book, will be published in the forthcoming Studia Islamika, which will be published in December. So please kindly bookmark the calendar and visit our social media channel on Facebook and Instagram for the information. And also please visit to the Studia Islamika website on uinjkt.ac.id. Thank you and see you in another event. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for having me. I greatly enjoyed it. Many thanks.
Thanks, Philipp.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Oh, now it's 10 o'clock here.